We're starting a new series at Crossroads today, and the background of it is I've been thinking about how often Jesus talks about ways in which we ought to live versus how often we distill the words of Jesus as a way to get to heaven. Now, I don't want to negate the last part. Jesus does teach us the way to eternal life. This is very important. But also there's a lot of times that Jesus talks about how we ought to live now. How we ought to pray things like, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And I started thinking that there are a lot of times that Jesus says things like, in John 14, chapter 6, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Or how in Matthew chapter 7, Jesus tells a whole story about how we ought to build our life on a foundation that is built on his teachings. That the way he teaches is the way we ought to live. That story goes like this. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house. Yet it did not fall because its foundation was on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like the foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. When Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, because he is taught as one with authority and not as their teachers of the law. Jesus is saying in texts like these that life is going to have trouble. It's going to be difficult. There will be not metaphorical, but real winds and rains and streams rise, and there will be difficulties that we face. And Jesus is teaching us that through these difficulties, living in the way he's teaching us to live will help us best when those difficulties come. And so I wanted to put into practice over these next few weeks, what does it mean to believe that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life? What does it mean to believe that anyone who hears these words and puts them into practice is most like the wise man? This is what I want to think about in this series. What does it mean to follow Jesus? What does his teachings about how to live mean? And most specifically, if we follow these words of Jesus, if we live a life on a firm foundation that he gives us, what are the ways in which that benefits us or helps us? What is it about Jesus' teachings that make his way better than the ways that we're taught in this world? Because a lot of times the way we talk about this is that if you follow Jesus, it will be hard, it will be tough, it'll be difficult, but at least you get to heaven in the end. But what if what Jesus is teaching us is, this is the better way to live because it will free you from the trappings of the modern world in which you live in? What if you are really and truly bound by things that you assume will set you free? What if the way that is just common sense to everyone around you is actually burdening you? What if it is actually making your life more difficult? And it's possible that we could read the stories and the teachings of Jesus through a different lens instead of saying, "Ooh, that sounds really tough." Maybe we can take a step back and listen to his teachings and say, well, maybe actually the way I am doing it is the burden and the tough way. And maybe doing it the Jesus way could free me in some way, shape, or form. And so we're going to start today by listening to some of the difficult teachings of Jesus. And we're going to start by what I'm going to tell you honestly from the very beginning is one of my least favorite teachings of Jesus. I think I've talked about this before as your pastor. I hate this teaching so very much. And that's part of the reason I want to start there, is because it's one of the ones that I've wrestled with most in my life. Because Jesus is saying one thing, and I really like to do the other thing. So Jesus is saying one thing, and everything about me longs to do the exact opposite of that. And so I stand back and I examine what it is that Jesus is teaching. And what I'm compelled by is to say, what if Jesus is right? What if I'm the one who is wrong? What if Jesus is right? What if his way is the way to abundant life? What if his way is the solid foundation and my way is just a sandy foundation that every time something goes wrong, I get washed away and caught up? And so we're going to read from the Gospel of Luke today. We're going to look at chapter 12, verses 22 to 34. And I'm going to invite you, if you would, to stand with me as we honor the reading of the word of the Lord today. Luke chapter 12, verses 22 to 34. Then Jesus said to his disciples, "Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat, or about your body, or what you will wear. For life is more than food, and the body more than clothes. Consider the ravens." It's appropriate for the first week of the NFL season, isn't it? Actually, some of you probably don't want to consider the ravens today, now that I think about it. Consider the ravens. They do not sow or reap. They have no storeroom or barn. Yet, God feeds them. And how much more valuable you are than birds. Who of you, by worrying, can add a single hour to your life? Since you cannot do this with this one very little thing, why do you worry about the rest? Consider how the wildflowers grow. They do not labor or spin, yet I tell you, not even Solomon in all of his splendor was dressed like one of these. If that is how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today and tomorrow thrown into the fire, how much more will he clothe you, you of little faith? And do not set your heart on what you will eat or drink. Do not worry about it. For the pagan world runs after such things, and your Father knows that you need them. But seek his kingdom, and these things will be given to you as well. Do not be afraid, little flock, for your Father has been pleased to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give to the poor. Provide purses for yourselves that will not wear out, a treasure in heaven that will never fail, where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. Well, I don't think I need to go on a long diatribe about why I hate these verses so much. My suspicion is that as we read through them, you found some level of comfort and familiarity and some level of disdain for what Jesus is teaching. Do not worry. How in the world are you supposed to not worry? Store up your treasures in heaven. Oh, that's a beautiful verse. I learned that in Sunday school when I was a kid. What does that look like? What does that mean? I have bills to pay here and now. Well, this story follows a parable that Jesus teaches. It's the parable of the rich fool. It's a funny little story, one you may or may not be familiar with, but it basically goes like this. Jesus tells a story of a rich man who has a lot of land, and the rains have been good, and the workers have been good, and he grows an incredible crop. So much crop, in fact, that he looks upon his vast land and his incredible barns and says, I do not have enough place to store all of my crops this year. So he doesn't think, maybe I'll give some away. He doesn't think, maybe I can help the poor. He doesn't think, maybe I can help my neighbors who haven't had as difficult of a year. He thinks to himself, I'm going to build bigger barns. And so he goes about building bigger barns. He tears down the old ones and builds mega barns. And he takes all of his crop and he stuffs it all in these massive barns, and it just barely fits to the last inch. And he looks upon them and he says, oh, that is incredible. I have done great work. Now, if you know anything about farming in this time in the world, you only get a great crop if the weather has been good. So he might be rich, he might have a lot, but really, he's just had good weather. And he thinks to himself, I have done an incredible thing. Look how wealthy I am. And one very famous verse of the Bible that probably is taken out of context a lot, like I know Dave Matthews Band sings about this. He looks upon his barn and he says, I'm going to eat, drink, and be merry now. I've got all I could ever possibly want. And Jesus throws a little kink in the story where he says, but guess what, guys? That guy died that night. He had a huge retirement waiting for him, but you don't know when you're going to go. You have no idea when you're going to die. And we're often planning for these incredible futures that we don't have control over. Now, in Jesus' time, farming was the way of life. So everyone who's gathering around to listen to Jesus tell this story lives in a rural world. In fact, in Israel at this point, there is 1.7 million acres that are suitable for growing crops. 70% of people who live in Israel live on agriculture. Like 100% live on agriculture, but 70% work in agriculture. And 90% of people live in rural areas at this time. Like think about how opposite that is from our world, where well over 50% of people live in urban areas now, right? Everyone lives in the country. And so everyone coming up to listen to Jesus teach lives in the country. And most of them work on farms or have farms. And they're listening to this story about Jesus talk about a rich, wealthy landowner. Well, there was one thing changing in the world that Jesus lived in, is that for the first time ever, there were mega farms sprouting up in Israel. In fact, there was a man in Shechem named, I'm going to butcher this name, so please forgive me. His name was Kawarnt Beni Hassan. And he owned 2,500 plus acres, not too far around the corner from where Jesus is telling this story. And so when Jesus tells this parable and we listen, we kind of like have this imagination of what a rich farmer might look like. The people who are listening to this probably have a name. They probably think, oh, it's that guy around the block who keeps buying up all of our land when we have a bad crop. That guy keeps sneaking our family farm into his own fortune. And he thinks he's winning at life when we're all losing. Just one bad summer of rain, and we could fall under debt, and our life is over. But he's got 2,500 acres of crops. He's got big barns in order to make it through next year and next. If I don't raise a crop this year, my kids are going to die. This story, this parable that Jesus is teaching, is real life to these people who are listening. It's not some imagination of what it would be like if there were a rich owner, but they are rivals to this rich landowner who seems to be making life very difficult on them. They probably listen to this story and think, yeah, death would really show that guy. Look at all of his crops. Look at all of his barns. Look at all the things that he has. That would really, really show him. Which reminds me that oftentimes when we're listening to a story, our perspective on the story changes everything about how we hear it. If there were people in the crowd who were wealthy, they would hear Jesus' story one way. And others who were poor and saw no way in order to get up from where they were would hear it in a different way. It's like standing on the opposite side of a number and deciding if it's 9 or 6, depending on which way you're looking at it. How is it that we hear this story then? Because if it's a bunch of poor farmers listening to Jesus, they're probably rooting against the rich fool. But if it's us today living in our world where we're a bit more affluent and self-sufficient, where we're not relying on a summer of good rain in order to just survive into 2025, we might hear this story in a completely different way. But either way, I invite you to slide your shoes into the foot of the rich fool for just one moment. It's typical that we want to slide ourselves into the shoes of Jesus. Because, spoiler, I'm a pastor, I think Jesus is always the one who's right. I always want to take Jesus' side. I imagine you do too. You assume that Jesus is right. This is a choice we make as Christians when we read the scriptures. But I think one effective way of reading the scriptures is sometimes to try on the shoes of the person who's clearly wrong, the person that Jesus is calling a fool, and see if those fit. Because all too often, they might be a little more comfy than we want to admit. And so the shoes of the rich fool fit us very, very well because we want to be him. We want to have so much stuff, so much accumulation, so many things that we fly high above the worries of life. We want to be able to build bigger houses, bigger barns, have bigger retirements, have bigger plans, because if we have stuff, money, more, enough, then we will not have to be caught up in the worries of day-to-day life. This is often the story that we tell yourself. And if you're thinking to yourself, that's not the story I tell myself, well, I can promise you that it's the story I tell myself. I get the rich fool. He's the one who makes sense to me in this story. I want to chase accumulation to have enough so that no one summer of bad rain will ruin my financial future. I want to have enough saved away for a rainy day. I want to have a retirement that's robust and exciting. I want to get to the day where I don't have to go to work and I can say to myself, what do I have to do today? Nothing but eat, drink, and be merry. I want to be that guy. And yet, Jesus says that's the foolish way of living. And I think to myself, what? How do you even imagine living in any other way than that? Jesus is critiquing the way I think, and I wonder, how do you do anything other than that? Well, in the text we've read today, there's a lot going on about worry. And it seems to me that Jesus is critiquing our desire to be worryless, to just not engage in life, to be just free and happy and wealthy and all of that. Jesus says, do not worry. After he tells the story of the rich fool, he goes on a long tirade about how we should not worry. Do not worry. And what's his reason that he says that we should not worry? Why should we not worry? Well, because life is more than food and the body more than clothes. That's what Jesus says. Life is more than food and the body is more than clothes. I suspect we can all agree with that. That's a fair enough statement. But then let's take one step back and think about what matters to us. How often does it matter to us that we eat at the nicest restaurants or wear the nicest clothes or look our best when we go out? How often do we think about our economic situation to decide if we can buy something nicer than what we already have? What is the way in which we think about earning? Are we just trying to make it, or are we trying to project image outside of ourselves? I want to give you a challenge real fast, a challenge that I undertook for myself this week. I want you to spend just about 30 seconds thinking about all of the things that you have to be worried about. All right? Could be bills or kids or what's for dinner tonight. Am I going to get that promotion? What college am I going to go to? That meeting I have on Monday morning? That test that's coming up on Wednesday? Just take a minute and think about all of the things that you have to be worried about. And I'll give you just a little bit of silence to think about it. Okay, did any of you have trouble thinking of something to be worried about? Okay, great. Well, wow, okay. Nice job. Worry is cheap. Worry is cheap. It is not hard to acquire worry. But now I want you to think about this. In light of the things that you are worried about or could be worried about, which of these things are you able to control? How many of the things that you're worried about do you actually have control over? Now, how about this? Of all of the things that you're worried about, what of those things has actual value? Actually matters for real? And what of these things that you're worried about actually lead to what your definition of a good life would be? You see, we very rarely spend time thinking about the things we worry about. We just worry. It's natural. Things that could cause tension come up, and we spill into worry. And I want to be clear here, I'm not preaching at you. I am chief among you. Because I've thought just about the last few weeks some things that I've been worried about. We had to sell a house, and I was afraid we weren't going to sell it for more than we owed on it. I worried a lot about that. I worry a lot about mine and my wife Sharice's schedule and how we're going to get our kids to all the places that they're committed to be at. I worry about that. Often worry about 5-minute junctures. Just think about how insane that is. 5 minutes I worry about. Are we going to be able to cover those 5 minutes? I have an upcoming review as pastor of this church. I worry about that. I worried about where Sharice would teach this year. Sharice is my wife, by the way. She was thinking about moving schools. I worried about that. Both of my girls are in high school now, which is an old person problem, I know, but that's where we're at. And I worry about both of them being in high school. Mackenzie is going to college in 2 years, and all of a sudden, this is new worry, this is fresh worry for me, but now all of a sudden I'm worried about sending my kid off to college, what it's going to be like without one of my kids in the house. That's a new worry for me that just cropped up in the last few weeks. I worry about parenting my daughters. Like, are we really teaching them Christian values, or are we accidentally teaching them worldly values? Are we intentional enough about handing off the faith to our kids that it becomes their own when they leave? These are just things that I've worried about in the last week. Some of them are big things. Some of them matter. Some of them are stupid. In the last few years, I've worried about other things as well. How am I going to pay these bills? It's amazing. No matter how much money you make, the bills keep coming. Just crazy. How am I going to pay all these bills? I worried years ago, will these kids ever sleep? Which was really me saying, will I ever sleep again? And then I remember, like when Mackenzie was little, she would scream and scream and scream and scream and scream until she fell asleep. And then once she fell asleep, I wouldn't think to myself, oh good, she's finally asleep. I would think, the screaming has stopped. Is she dead? Do I need to check on her? I worry about whether or not I'm following God's will or my own will. It's very easy for those two things to become the same thing in your mind. I worry about that a lot. I worry about if I'm doing enough for retirement. I worry about how I can make, put yourself in any situation, how I can make these people like me. It becomes really, really important to me. I want people to like me. I've spent a lot of years. I have a lot of bald patches on my head that I could actually point to and name as these worries in my life. So many of our worries are trivial, and not all of them are. But we all have our worries. We have things that have stressed us out. Some things that I've not necessarily had to face, but are big, big worries that are not trivial at all, are things like massive diagnoses, loss of job, divorce, or even facing death. We can worry about things that are big. We can worry about things that are small. Sometimes they're worth worrying about, and sometimes they are not worry about. And I come into this text and I bring this bulk, this load of worry, and I drop it in front of these words that Jesus teaches. And I say, well, what am I supposed to do with all of this stuff then, Jesus? You're saying do not worry, and that sounds crazy to me. How in the world do you not worry? But it seems to me that as I was reflecting on this text, one of the things that I keep learning by coming back to the teachings of Jesus isn't that I was wrong to worry, but that I need to start learning the lesson that when I have worry, God meets me in that worry. You see, the rich fool seemed to want to create a life for himself where he didn't need a God. He was God. He had taken care of all of his needs on his own. He was in charge. His future was in his hand, and then it wasn't. Because there was that which was beyond his control. He was the God of his own world, but he was not the God of death. Accumulation can only get us so far in terms of controlling our world. Acquiring power, stuff, money only gets us so far in terms of control. What Jesus is teaching us here is there is a lot that is beyond our control. Sometimes it matters and sometimes it doesn't, but we need to learn to let God be God and to follow him. To risk every once in a while believing that God will come through for us, that God sees us. You see, we live in a world, in a moment where a lot of people are talking about and wondering if God is real. Is God even real? Where is God? Why would God let this happen or that happen? If God were really who he says he would, why doesn't he fix the problems of the world that we live in? And I think that it's often in our struggles, in the things that we worry about, that God makes himself most clear. That sometimes, rather than trying to situate our life where it's nice and controlled and we have everything we need and we've done it under our own power, that's not much of a story to tell at all. That it's often in our weakness, in the places that we've given up control, in the places that we've learned to trust God or been willing to trust God, that God does his most miraculous work. And oftentimes the story that we most love to tell aren't the stories about how we overcame the world. No one likes to hear a story about how awesome you are. But the stories we most like to tell is when we were at our wits' end, where we had nothing left, when we were up against it, when we had no way out, and somehow, some way, against all odds, life broke in our direction. And we can say, that's where I saw God show up. I was filled with worry. I was out of control. I didn't know what was going to happen. And yet, a faithful God who sees me and knows my name and knows my situation healed me, comforted me, made a way for me, helped me, showed me a path forward. Oftentimes, our worry, not all the time, but oftentimes our worry is just naming that we don't know if God sees us. But if we learn to live with faith that God might show up, we might find that these words that Jesus teaches us is true. That he feeds the ravens and clothes the lilies. How much more does he care about you? And if we really began to bought those lines, we might start living just a little different. We might start auditing our life a little bit different. We might start aiming ourselves in trajectories that are just a little bit different. And so I want to give you another audit challenge. I challenge you to audit your worry. Now, think for just a moment, in the last 5 years, when have you been at your absolute happiest? Now, I'm not asking you to go back to 1975 or 2004, but just the last 5 years, when have you been at your absolute happiest? I did this audit for myself, and it was surprising, and then it kind of wasn't. So I thought about, what is the thing, what have I done that makes me the happiest? And the answer has always been travel. When I travel, when I go see new places. And here's some pictures I've taken along the way from the top of the Hoover Dam in Germany and in Las Vegas on cruises, going on vacations to Disney with my girls. Now, of course, that takes money and planning and saving and all that kind of stuff to do those sort of things. But I noticed that when I was spending, I was happier when I was making memories than when I was walking through Target or the mall. I wasn't happier because I bought something brand new. I was happier when I leveraged my money to spend time with my family. I thought about, my girls are both athletes. You probably know this because that's like all I talk about if I'm not preaching. I thought about how almost all my joy in the last 5 years has been on ball fields and soccer fields and in gyms, watching them win and grow and get better, seeing them move from one place to another, going through struggles and then winning victories, investing my time in helping them become better and then seeing them win trophies, awards, players of the game, lineup spots that are incredible, carrying teams through and to championships. That has made me happy. In fact, that has made me happier than any victory I had as an athlete when I was a kid. So seeing my girls grow, advance, become better, winning, that has made me happy. And then finally, this is a little sappy, but like my wife makes me happy. Yeah, right? I told, this is true, I didn't tell you this, sorry, forgive me. But I told the pastoral staff today, we were talking about marriage, and I said, Sharice is my favorite person in the world. She also drives me more crazy than anyone else in the world. And to which one of the staff members, who I won't tell you who, said, yeah, I think you're just describing marriage, Tim. That's probably right? But like every time I can be with Sharice and do something with Sharice, that makes me happy. And there you go, there's my list. That's what brings me the most joy in my world. It turns out the people near me and then doing stuff with and for those people is what makes me the most happy. And then I think about that versus the stories we tell ourselves, what we drive ourselves in the ground for that we think will make us happy. These are the sort of stories in our world that we think will make us happy. Money, bigger houses, nicer stuff, better vacations, better nights out, better meals, better drinks, getting in better schools, having better cars. These are the things we think, if I could just get those things, then I'll be winning in life. And yet, they don't satisfy. We worry and worry and worry, and we put ourselves through all sorts of stress in order to accumulate, and yet it doesn't make us happy. Now, in case you think that I'm wrong, I want to use a case in point for you. I heard someone talking about this week, and I was blown away by it because I realized it's probably true. There's an irony in our world today where we think that the economy stinks. Like you ask any American, they say the economy stinks. It's the number one issue heading into the presidential election. Everyone thinks the economy stinks. And so I started thinking about what it was like living in the 1980s versus the 2020s when the economy stinks. In the 1980s, when I was a child, most families got one vacation a year, and usually it was very, very locally, like to a cabin in the woods or to a beach. The richest people I knew had cable television. That was like if you had cable, you were rich when I was a kid. Every family I knew had one car, and the wealthiest of the wealthy were able to make long distance phone calls before 7 p.m. If you could go out to eat at a sit-down restaurant that wasn't Pizza Hut, you were crazy rich. My family went to Pizza Hut when I read enough books to report to my librarian, and I could get one of those cards to bring home to them. If I was really lucky, we could go to Taco Bell, where I was told I could order off the 59, 79, 99-cent value meal. That was wealthy. That was like really making it in the middle class 40 years ago. And almost all of us do that every single week or more. Which family has only one car today? Which family worries about long-distance calls? Who doesn't have cable? We've got 7 streaming services and cable. Like, we are so well off, even compared to our own lifetime. Like, every family I know, thinks they need to bring their kid to Europe now. The best vacation I ever had as a kid was going to a lighthouse that my dad managed as part of the Coast Guard. That was the best vacation I ever went on. And now kids are traversing Europe and going to Disney every summer. And we're not happier now. In fact, I hear most people saying, wouldn't it be nice to go back to more simple times? We've accumulated and accumulated and accumulated, and yet we're still struggling. And so I think about this teaching of Jesus. And I think what Jesus exposes within me, and maybe within you as well, is a misaligned life. We're chasing after more, and when we have it, we don't even notice that we've gotten it. We're still not satisfied. And what we want, what we think we want, rarely does satisfy us. And what truly gives us joy, we rarely long for. How many of us, if we think, it's my family, it's my kids, it's my wife, it's my parents, that's what give me joy, how many of us are thinking this next week, I'm going to prioritize time with them? And how many of us instead are thinking about prioritizing the next goal, the next thing, the next accumulation? And so as we go today, as we close up, I invite you to think seriously about the audits that we've talked about today. What makes you most worried, and what gives you the most joy? And if you could process through those things, the times that you've been most worried, what has that worry given you? Has it given you a gift, or has it given you a burden? And then think about the things that make you most joyful. When are you most happy? When are you most full of life? When are you living the best life? When are you on top of the mountain? And how did you get there? And did you orient and align your life to get there? Or do we keep orienting ourselves towards the things that give us worry and away from the things that give us joy? Jesus says, he closes up all this by saying, seek first the kingdom. Take risks for the kingdom. Sell your possessions. Give them to poor. Don't be caught up in the things of this world, because you're going to find, and this is a famous teaching of Jesus, that where your treasure is, that's where your heart's going to be too. And if our treasure keeps ending up in barns in our backyards, because we have to have some place to place all of our accumulations, well, one day we're going to not wake up. One day life is going to be over. And if all we have to say is, well, we had a barn in the backyard filled with retirement goodies, that's not much of a story to tell about how we lived life. Let's stop worrying about the things that we can't take with us, that don't even bring us joy, that we assume are going to make us happy. And let's follow the teachings of Jesus. Seek first his kingdom. And Jesus says, this is great. All these other things will be added onto that. It's about reorienting. So I invite you to think about this, ponder this, pray about it, and ask that God would open your eyes to what the good life is through the lens of Jesus. Would you stand with me as we sing this final song?